a voice that birthed heavy metal, a band that dethroned the Beatles, a charred body pulled from a burning cottage with an empty bank account. Between the gold records and the ashes lies the darkest secret of the 1960s music machine. The Small Faces generated absolute fortunes, but a mafia-linked manager paid them in nothing but clothes. Terrorized by thugs and bled dry by accountants, the ultimate fashion icons were working themselves into an early grave. But the invisible chains that bound them were not forged in the glittering music clubs. They were manufactured on the very streets that raised them. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the East End of London was a landscape of lingering devastation and suffocating limitations. For young, working-class boys growing up in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the future was an industrial conveyor belt. They were expected to leave school at the earliest opportunity, enter the factories, or work the perilous docks of the River Thames. It was an existence defined by rigid class boundaries and a profound lack of social mobility. However, a silent, aesthetically driven rebellion was beginning to take shape among the youth. This was the birth of the mod subculture. Steve Marriott himself was the perfect, hyperactive avatar of this street-level renaissance. Having spent his early teenage years working as a child actor, famously playing the artful Dodger in the musical Oliver, he possessed a natural theatrical swagger combined with an encyclopedic knowledge of imported Black American soul records. He spent his days hustling in East End music shops, absorbing the vocal techniques of Muddy Waters and Ray Charles, practicing in front of mirrors until his vocal cords bled. Marriott was not just looking to join a band. He was constructing a weaponized musical identity meant to smash through the class ceiling. The mod movement was a psychological armor forged by the working class. It was not simply a shallow preoccupation with fashion. It was a defiant rejection of their assigned societal roles. Young men who earned meager weekly wages in dirty, exhausting jobs would pool every available resource to purchase impeccably tailored Italian suits, expensive Chelsea boots, and imported silk shirts. They refused to wear the drab, practical clothing of their fathers. As a collective unit, the Small Faces embodied this philosophy with absolute fanaticism. They adopted a shared identity. Their name itself was a declaration of their unified status within this culture. Small, because none of the four members stood over 5 feet 5 inches tall, and Faces, because in the slang of the era, a face was an individual of paramount respect, influence, and impeccable style. This intense bond was initially their greatest strength. When Lane, Jones, McLagan, and Marriott crowded into tiny, sweat-soaked rehearsal rooms, they operated with a telepathic understanding. They were obsessed with the raw, emotional power of American rhythm and blues, artists like Otis Redding and Muddy Waters, and they sought to replicate that sound with a uniquely British, hyper-aggressive energy. Their early live performances were not merely concerts, they were chaotic, high-voltage tribal gatherings. The four of them played with a desperate, unified hunger. At the center of this musical hurricane was the magical, deeply contrasting songwriting partnership between Marriott and Ronnie Lane. Lane was the quiet poet, frequently arriving at rehearsals with gentle, introspective acoustic chord progressions inspired by pastoral English folk. Marriott would instantly seize these delicate melodies, dragging them through the dirt of his heavy rhythm guitar, and injecting them with his primal gravel-toned roar. They perfectly balanced each other, Lane providing the sensitive beating heart of the composition, while Marriott delivered the brass-knuckled knockout punch to the audience. However, this relentless energy was not purely organic. To sustain the grueling demands of the mod club circuit, playing multiple highly physically demanding sets late into the night, the entire band was introduced to the dark underbelly of the 1960s nightlife, amphetamines. The use of leapers or speed was deeply ingrained in the mod culture. For the small faces, pills became the chemical glue that held their exhausting schedule together. But this shared habit began to plant the earliest seeds of instability. Amphetamines create an illusion of invincibility and boundless brotherhood, but they also severely amplify paranoia, sleep deprivation, and nervous exhaustion. The band was operating at a dangerous, unsustainable velocity. They were moving so fast, fueled by chemical stimulation and the intoxicating rush of sudden local fame, that they completely failed to see the trap being laid carefully beneath their feet. By 1965, the British music industry had recognized the immense, highly lucrative potential of the youth market. Record executives were scouring the clubs for authenticity. The Small Faces had a rabid, devoted following, unmatched musical chemistry, and the perfect aesthetic. Yet as a collective, they shared a fatal flaw. They possessed absolutely no understanding of the ruthless, predatory mechanics of the entertainment business. They were naive teenagers, desperate for a recording contract, willing to sign away their lives for the mere promise of seeing their records in shop windows. This profound naivety led them directly into the hands of management that operated far outside the bounds of conventional business ethics. They were soon entirely controlled by individuals deeply connected to the London underworld. Under this regime, the band ceased to be a brotherhood of musicians and was aggressively transformed into a strictly controlled, unpaid money-making machine. Whenever the band was summoned to Arden's Carnaby Street office, the atmosphere shifted from the joyful chaos of the recording studio to the chilling silence of an interrogation room. The boys would sit nervously on leather sofas surrounded by Arden's physically imposing associates, who stood silently by locked doors. Arden himself would sit behind a massive mahogany desk, puffing thick cigar smoke, projecting an aura of total, terrifying authority. In that room, nobody dared to ask about royalty percentages or contract clauses. They merely nodded, signed where they were told, and prayed they could leave the room without physical consequence. The realization of this exploitation did not happen instantly. It was a slow, agonizing dawn that broke over the entire group. The amphetamines, once used to fuel their joyful performances, now fueled deep-seated paranoia and bitter internal arguments. The pressure of constantly delivering hit singles, combined with the terrifying realization that they were effectively destitute despite their global fame, began to fracture their once unbreakable brotherhood. Their rise was meteoric, fueled by chart-topping hits like All or Nothing, Sha-La-La-La-Lee, and the psychedelic masterpiece Itchycoo Park. They became a global phenomenon. Their faces were plastered across every major music publication. Whenever they appeared in public, they were swarmed by thousands of hysterical fans, requiring heavy police escorts just to walk down the street. They were generating massive, unprecedented wealth for their record label. Yet the blinding flashbulbs merely obscured a calculated financial drain. They were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't simply walk away from, paralyzed by a very real, physical fear of the underworld figures who controlled their every move, their every sound, and their every penny. Despite their chart-topping success, the band's financial reality remained frozen in Arden's deeply cynical system. Their compensation was restricted entirely to Carnaby Street store credits. While the press paraded them as the affluent icons of swinging London behind closed doors, they were entirely reliant on their manager's office for basic food and rent allowances, living mannequins trapped within their own meticulously crafted image. Their daily existence was a brutal contradiction. Ian McLagan and Kenny Jones would frequently return from national television appearances, draped in hundreds of pounds worth of Italian silk and crushed velvet, only to unlock the doors to freezing, unheated apartments. They would huddle around small gas heaters, wearing their bespoke jackets just to keep warm, completely unable to afford a pint of milk or a bus fare. They were trapped in a cruel pantomime, forced to hide their literal poverty from the hysterical fans camped outside their windows who believed they were millionaires. This form of control was incredibly insidious. The small faces were working themselves to the point of absolute physical and nervous exhaustion, playing relentless strings of live shows, fueled heavily by the amphetamines that were rampant in the 1960s club scene. They were pouring their souls into recording sessions that would define British pop history. And for all this monumental effort, their sole currency, their only tangible reward for changing the world, was a wardrobe of expensive suits they rarely had the time or energy to wear outside of a television studio. For the small faces, this intellectual observation was a daily, suffocating reality. They were trapped in a glittering, velvet-lined cage. But the true horror of their situation was not just financial ruin. As the exhaustion mounted and the realization of their empty bank accounts slowly began to dawn on them, they quickly discovered that they could not simply hire a lawyer and walk away. Their manager was not a man who negotiated in courtrooms. The invisible chains that bound the small faces were forged in fear, and the man holding the keys was about to demonstrate exactly what happened to anyone who dared to cross him. Behind the velvet suits and infectious melodies of swinging London, the true mechanics of the 1960s music industry operated in smoke-filled, shadowy offices. The British music business was a lawless frontier, fiercely contested by powerful men operating far outside the boundaries of conventional commerce. At the absolute apex of this ruthless hierarchy stood a man who did not merely manage artists, he ruled them. His name was Don Arden. Born Harry Levy into a working-class family in Manchester, Arden had spent his early years navigating the unforgiving world of post-war British cabaret and talent management. By the time the British invasion took the globe by storm in the mid-1960s, Arden had positioned himself as a formidable force. He was known as the godfather of British pop, a moniker bestowed not out of affection, but out of deep-seated, industry-wide terror. Others simply called him the Al Capone of pop. 4 incredibly talented musicians, whose faces were adored by millions of fans worldwide, submitted to this system of total financial starvation because Arden's methodology bypassed standard legal frameworks entirely. He governed his roster not through meticulous contracts, but through sheer intimidation, psychological manipulation, and the ever-present threat of physical violence. In the modern era, an artist dissatisfied with their management would simply hire an entertainment lawyer to audit their accounts and dissolve their contract. For the Small Faces in 1966, this was not a viable reality. They were teenage boys from the East End. They had no legal representation, no financial advisors, and no understanding of corporate law. Don Arden actively cultivated this isolation. He presented himself as a fiercely protective paternal figure to the outside world, fiercely defending his boys from rival promoters. But behind closed doors, he was an absolute dictator. He ensured that the band members were kept entirely in the dark regarding their record sales, international publishing rights, and concert revenues. However, psychological manipulation was only one weapon in Arden's arsenal. When his authority was challenged, he was notorious for resorting to tactics straight out of the criminal underworld. The most chilling and infamous incident that cemented Arden's fearsome reputation and irrevocably shattered any remaining innocence within the Small Faces occurred in 1966, involving a highly successful rival manager named Robert Stigwood. Robert Stigwood was an Australian-born impresario who would later go on to manage the Bee Gees and produce colossal cultural touchstones like Saturday Night Fever. At the time, Stigwood was a polished, immensely wealthy, and powerful figure in the London scene. Observing the massive commercial success of the Small Faces and quietly catching wind of the band's growing whispered discontent regarding their lack of money, Stigwood saw a lucrative opportunity. He made discreet inquiries, attempting to poach the Small Faces from Don Arden's roster. It was a fatal miscalculation of the rules by which Don Arden played. Arden's response was neither a counteroffer nor a lawsuit. Instead, he gathered his East End enforcers and paid a visit to Robert Stigwood's elegant multi-story office in central London. What transpired next has become one of the darkest legends in British music history. While the exact details can vary slightly depending on the source, the core narrative remains a terrifying testament to Arden's brutality. Many accounts state that Arden and his men stormed into Stigwood's office, bypassing his terrified staff. Arden allegedly confronted Stigwood directly, physically assaulting him. The sheer terror of the encounter peaked when Arden reportedly instructed his men to drag the rival manager toward the large office window. Don Arden grabbed Stigwood by the neck and physically suspended him, or threatened to throw him, out of the fourth-floor window. As Stigwood allegedly dangled over the unforgiving London pavement, Arden made a terrifyingly calm, unambiguous demand. Stigwood was to never speak to, look at, or attempt to contact the Small Faces ever again. If he did, the next time he went out a window, there would be no one holding him back. When the horrific details of this encounter filtered through the underground network of London clubs and finally reached the Small Faces, a paralyzing silence fell over the band. They sat together in a dimly lit pub, exchanging terrified glances as the grim reality of their signatures on Arden's paper finally crystallized in their minds. They realized they were not merely clients dealing with a tough negotiator. They were the property of a violent syndicate. Any childish fantasies they harbored about staging a rebellion or demanding an audit died instantly in that moment. Stigwood, deeply traumatized and humiliated, immediately complied. He dropped all efforts to sign the band and, according to some sources, was so severely shaken by the ordeal that he temporarily suspended his business operations to recover from the psychological shock. When news of this violently theatrical display of power inevitably reached Steve Marriott, Ronnie Lane, Kenny Jones, and Ian McClagan, the psychological impact was devastating. On stage, they were the vibrant, energetic voices of a liberated youth generation. They were singing joyful, rebellious anthems like "What You Gonna Do About It" to seas of screaming teenagers. But the moment they stepped off the stage, they were plunged back into a reality governed by mafia-style retribution. The Stigwood incident was a horrific wake-up call. The small faces suddenly realized the true, terrifying nature of their predicament. They had not signed a standard business agreement with an entertainment agency. They had effectively sold themselves into indentured servitude to a syndicate. The realization that their manager was capable of dangling a powerful, wealthy executive out of a window completely paralyzed them. If Don Arden could do that to a millionaire rival, what would he do to 4 replaceable working-class teenagers from the East End if they dared to demand their unpaid royalties? This environment of fear created a prison without bars. The band members were gripped by a profound, suffocating paranoia. They could not go to the police, as the culture of the 1960s East End dictated a strict code of silence regarding underworld affairs, and they feared the authorities would offer no real protection against Arden's far-reaching connections. They could not strike or refuse to play because they relied entirely on Arden's office for their daily living allowances and the roofs over their heads. For Steve Marriott and his bandmates, this fear began to take a severe toll on their mental and physical health. The exhaustion of playing over 200 shows a year was now compounded by chronic anxiety. The amphetamines, previously used merely to stay awake during long tours, were increasingly used to numb the terrifying reality of their situation. The recording studio, once a sanctuary of creative brotherhood, was now tainted by the knowledge that every brilliant melody they composed and every hit record they produced was only enriching the very man who held them hostage. They were trapped in a paradox of extreme fame and extreme powerlessness. The Small Faces were the kings of Carnaby Street, the idols of the mod movement, and the voices of a generation. Yet, in the quiet, terrifying moments alone in their manager-funded apartments, they knew the truth. They were victims of a sophisticated, violent extortion racket. And as the financial pressure mounted and the mental strain pushed them to the absolute brink of collapse, they knew that a breaking point was imminent. They could not survive in this state of terror indefinitely. A storm was gathering, and the resulting collision would alter the course of their lives forever. The breaking point for the Small Faces did not originate from within the band itself. The 4 young men, Steve Marriott, Ronnie Lane, Kenny Jones, and Ian McClagan, were entirely paralyzed by the psychological grip and the very real physical threat posed by their management. The catalyst for their desperate escape came from the very place they had tried to leave behind, the modest working-class living rooms of the East End. By 1966, a stark absurdity emerged between their public image and private reality. The Small Faces were international superstars. They were consistently appearing on national television programs like Top of the Pops and Ready, Steady, Go. Their faces adorned the covers of magazines across Europe. Yet when the television sets were turned off and the boys returned to their families for a Sunday roast, the illusion shattered. Working-class parents in the East End of London possessed a highly attuned, almost instinctual understanding of the value of hard labor. They were not easily blinded by the glittering lights of the entertainment industry. When the parents of the band members realized that their sons were selling hundreds of thousands of records, constantly touring and universally famous, yet routinely coming home to ask to borrow a few pounds for a taxi fare or a decent meal, alarm bells began to ring loudly. It was the mothers and fathers of the small faces who finally pierced the veil of Don Arden's deception. The parents began asking the fundamental practical questions that the teenagers had been too terrified to voice. Where were the performance royalties? Where was the publishing money for the songs Marriott and Lane had written? Why were the boys living off a meager weekly allowance dispensed by the management office, while their record label raked in fortunes? The confrontation that followed was a clash of two entirely different worlds. The working-class parents, armed with nothing but protective instinct and a demand for basic fairness, attempted to demand answers from a management structure that operated like a mafia syndicate. When inquiries were made regarding the band's financial accounts, the responses from Arden's camp were evasive, intimidating, and deeply hostile. The parents quickly realized that their sons were entirely ensnared in a predatory contract that legally bound them to the management, while effectively stripping them of all financial autonomy. The clothes, the Carnaby Street credit accounts, and the public adoration were nothing more than a smokescreen, obscuring a massive, systematic financial extraction. Faced with this horrific reality, the small faces made the most terrifying decision of their young lives. They decided to break their contract and run. This was not a standard corporate severance. In the context of the 1960s London music scene, defying Don Arden was akin to attempting to leave a criminal enterprise. It was a frantic, highly dangerous defection. The immediate aftermath of their departure plunged all four members into a state of profound psychological terror. They were acutely aware of the Robert Stigwood incident. They knew exactly what their former management was capable of when challenged. For weeks, the band lived in a state of high alert, constantly looking over their shoulders. The band members frequently changed their addresses, hiding in different flats to avoid being tracked down. They lived with the constant gnawing fear that a group of East End heavies would kick down their doors in the middle of the night to exact physical revenge or violently disrupt their live performances to send a brutal message to the rest of the industry. This period of hiding inflicted deep, lasting psychological scars on the entire collective. The brotherhood that had been forged in the joy of playing rhythm and blues was now bonded by shared trauma and crippling paranoia. The amphetamines that were once used to sustain their energy on stage were now exacerbating their anxiety, creating a toxic mental environment. Salvation, or what initially appeared to be salvation, eventually arrived in the form of Andrew Loog Oldham. Oldham was a highly charismatic, flamboyant figure who managed the Rolling Stones and had recently founded his own independent record label, Immediate Records. Oldham represented the absolute antithesis of Don Arden. Where Arden was a menacing old-school enforcer, Oldham was a young, hip visionary who spoke the language of the counterculture. He championed artistic freedom, experimentation, and a bohemian lifestyle. When the Small Faces signed with Immediate Records in 1967, it felt like a miraculous rescue. They believed they had finally escaped the dark, violent underworld of the music business and entered a utopian sanctuary of creative liberty. Under Oldham's guidance, the band was finally allowed to shed their manufactured, purely pop-oriented image. They moved away from the restrictive 3-minute singles dictated by Arden and began to experiment wildly in the recording studio. This era produced their undisputed masterpiece, the 1968 concept album Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. It was a psychedelic, brilliantly cohesive record that showcased the absolute peak of Marriott and Lane's songwriting partnership, McLagan's deeply textured keyboard work, and Jones's innovative drumming. The album topped the UK charts for 6 consecutive weeks. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the Small Faces had triumphed. They had survived the mob, found their true artistic voice, and created a record that would cement their legacy in the pantheon of British music. However, the tragedy of the Small Faces is a story of compounding betrayals. While Immediate Records offered boundless creative freedom, it was fundamentally chaotic, heavily fueled by recreational drugs and plagued by catastrophic financial mismanagement. Oldham was a brilliant creative director, but many historians note he was a disastrous accountant. The label was burning through cash at an astonishing rate, funding lavish lifestyles, experimental recording sessions, and extravagant promotional campaigns. The grim, devastating realization slowly crept up on Marriott, Lane, Jones, and McLagan. They had traded a violent, tyrannical dictator for a chaotic, disorganized visionary, but the ultimate financial result was exactly the same. Despite the massive critical and commercial success of Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, the royalties were simply not materializing. The money was vanishing into the disorganized, debt-ridden vortex of Immediate Records. For the Small Faces, this second betrayal was the fatal blow, surviving Arden's violence only to drown in Oldham's financial chaos, completely shattered whatever fragile faith they had left in the industry. The brotherhood began to fracture under the immense weight of disillusionment. Steve Marriott, in particular, was becoming deeply frustrated. He was widely considered one of the greatest vocalists of his generation, yet he was broke. Furthermore, the brilliant, complex arrangements of Ogden's Nut Gone Flake proved nearly impossible to reproduce live with the primitive sound systems of the late 1960s. Marriott felt trapped in a pop psychedelic image when he desperately wanted to play heavier, harder, and more aggressive blues rock. Ronnie Lane, the emotional core and primary melodic architect of the band, retreated further into a state of melancholy and spiritual searching. The joyful telepathy that once defined their rehearsals was replaced by bitter arguments, creative frustration, and an overwhelming sense of futility. They were 4 exhausted veterans of a war they didn't even realize they were fighting until it was too late. The breaking point arrived on New Year's Eve, 1968. During a tense, chaotic live performance at the Alexandra Palace in London, the accumulated years of unpaid royalties, mafia terror, management betrayal, and creative suffocation finally caused the band to implode. In the middle of the set, a deeply frustrated and disillusioned Steve Marriott simply stopped playing. He threw down his guitar, walked off the stage, and effectively ended the Small Faces. The golden era of the East End mods was over. They had escaped the violent grasp of the underworld, but the industry had successfully drained their youth, their trust, and their collective spirit. The band lay in ruins, but the darkest chapters for the individual members, particularly their visionary frontman, were still yet to unfold. The sudden, shocking walkout by Steve Marriott on New Year's Eve in 1968 did not merely signify the death of the Small Faces. It marked the beginning of a profoundly tragic second act for one of Britain's most gifted frontmen. When Marriott threw down his guitar on the stage of the Alexandra Palace, he was not just walking away from his bandmates. He was desperately attempting to walk away from a pop idol image that he had grown to despise, and a financial apparatus that had systematically drained him of his youth and his earnings. He was 21 years old, a veteran of the music industry's darkest trenches, and he was determined to finally seize control of his own destiny. Driven by an immense, almost frantic creative hunger, Marriott immediately set out to form a new musical entity. He wanted to strip away the psychedelic pop production and the velvet suits of Carnaby Street. He sought a return to raw, unapologetic heavy rhythm and blues. To achieve this, he joined forces with Peter Frampton, a highly talented guitarist who had recently left the pop group The Herd, alongside bassist Greg Ridley from Spooky Tooth, and a young drummer named Jerry Shirley. They called themselves Humble Pie. The formation of Humble Pie represented Marriott's ultimate artistic liberation. Unshackled from the restrictive pop formats of the mid-1960s, Marriott evolved into a terrifyingly powerful stage presence. As the 1970s dawned, the music industry was shifting from the screaming pop concerts of theater venues to the colossal, deafening environment of the American arena rock circuit. Humble Pie was perfectly engineered for this new era. They embarked on grueling, relentless tours across the United States. While the Small Faces had been largely confined to the European market, Humble Pie conquered America through sheer brute force. Their live performances, heavily documented in the legendary 1971 album performance Rockin' the Fillmore, are often cited by critics as some of the most blistering, high-octane hard rock shows ever recorded. Marriott's voice, an unbelievable roar emerging from his small frame, dominated massive stadiums. He was widely idolized by a new generation of rock musicians. Figures like Paul Stanley of Kiss and a young Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin studied Marriott's stagecraft with intense reverence. Humble Pie was generating enormous revenue. They were flying on private jets, playing to tens of thousands of fans a night, and selling records by the truckload. To the outside observer, it appeared that Steve Marriott had finally won. He had survived the mafia-style terror of Don Arden, escaped the chaotic collapse of Immediate Records, and successfully rebuilt himself into a global rock deity. Yet beneath this staggering American success, a familiar and devastating pattern was quietly repeating itself. The management landscape of 1970s stadium rock was different from the East End gangsterism of the 1960s, but it was often just as predatory, albeit clothed in more sophisticated corporate suits. Humble Pie was managed by D. Anthony, a powerful American music executive known for his aggressive promotional tactics. While it is undeniable that Anthony broke the ban in the United States, historical accounts and later financial audits reveal a dark reality regarding the distribution of wealth. While Humble Pie grossed millions of dollars during their peak touring years, Marriott and his bandmates saw only a fraction of that money. The financial structures were incredibly opaque, often involving complex webs of touring expenses, management commissions, and unfavorable royalty splits. Once again, Marriott was working himself to the absolute limit of human endurance, singing with a ferocity that physically tore at his vocal cords, only to find that the vast fortunes he was generating were being siphoned away into accounts he did not control. The physical toll of screaming over deafening arena sound systems night after night began to manifest in horrific ways. Associates from that era recall Marriott coughing up blood into hotel bathroom sinks after exhausting 3-hour sets, his throat utterly shredded. Yet instead of prescribing rest, management doctors were frequently brought in to administer heavy steroid injections directly into his vocal cords, just to push him back onto the stage the next night. He was no longer treated as a human being or an artist. He was handled like a prized racehorse, being mercilessly whipped toward the finish line. When the realization finally hit Marriott that he was, for the third time in his life, the victim of massive financial exploitation, it broke something fundamental within his spirit. The psychological resilience that had carried him through the abuses of the Small Faces era was entirely depleted. He had given his soul to rock and roll. He had reached the absolute zenith of the industry, and he was still being treated as an unpaid laborer. This profound disillusionment triggered a catastrophic downward spiral. To cope with the grueling physical pain of nonstop touring, the mental exhaustion, and the bitter betrayal of his finances, Marriott began to self-medicate heavily. The occasional amphetamines of the mod era were replaced by severe chronic alcoholism and a heavy reliance on cocaine. His behavior became increasingly erratic and destructive. The once laser-focused musical genius was slowly being consumed by addiction and a deep, festering anger toward the industry that had repeatedly robbed him. By the mid-1970s, Humble Pie fractured and eventually dissolved. Marriott found himself in a position that was almost incomprehensible for a man of his stature. The architect of the mod movement, the stadium-conquering rock god, was essentially bankrupt. As the 1980s arrived, the music world moved on, transitioning into the eras of punk, new wave, and eventually MTV. Steve Marriott, stripped of his wealth and suffering the severe physical consequences of long-term substance abuse, was left behind. He returned to England, a ghost haunting the industry he helped build. The contrast between his past glory and his present reality was utterly devastating. In order to simply pay his rent and fund his ongoing addictions, Marriott was forced to return to the live music circuit. But there were no more private jets or sold-out arenas. Instead, he formed a series of loosely organized pub bands, most notably playing under the name Packet of Three. In his later years, Marriott was reduced to playing in small, sticky-carpeted pubs in working-class areas of London and Essex. There, in dimly lit rooms holding barely 100 people, one of the greatest vocalists in the history of British music would set up his own equipment, plug his guitar into a battered amplifier, and sing for beer money. Observers noted that even in these squalid conditions, his voice retained a terrifying raw power. He would sweat profusely, screaming the blues with a furious intensity, singing the very songs that had made other men millionaires. He was a living tragedy, a king forced to perform as a court jester in the very kingdom he had built. His personal life was a mirror of his professional ruin. His marriages dissolved, his relationships were strained by his erratic temper and severe alcoholism, and his physical health was visibly deteriorating. He had developed a heavy reliance on prescription sedatives, particularly Valium, to combat his alcohol withdrawals and chronic anxiety. He was a man completely broken by the machinery of fame, living in a constant state of exhaustion and bitterness. This tragic trajectory inevitably leads us to the grim events of April 1991. Marriott had recently returned to the United Kingdom after a brief, deeply frustrating trip to the United States, where he had been attempting to organize a humble pie reunion. The trip had been chaotic, marred by his severe drinking and internal disagreements. He arrived back in London physically shattered and deeply depressed. Late on April 19th, he traveled back to his 16th century thatched cottage in the village of Arkesden, Essex, before the fatal fire erupted in the early hours of April 20th. The events of that final evening are reconstructed through official fire investigation reports and toxicology results. Marriott, alone in the house, consumed a massive lethal quantity of alcohol, which he combined with a heavy dose of prescription Valium. The combination of alcohol and strong chemical sedatives induced a state of deep, unnatural unconsciousness. At some point late in the night, Marriott, heavily intoxicated, lay down on his bed with a lit cigarette. In his deeply sedated state, he fell asleep. The cigarette slipped from his fingers, landing on the bedding. What started as a slow smolder quickly escalated. In a historic cottage constructed of old dry timber and topped with a highly flammable thatched roof, the fire spread with catastrophic speed. Within minutes, the bedroom was engulfed in a violent sea of flames. The thick, toxic smoke and the intense heat offered no chance of escape for a man paralyzed by sedatives. By the time the fire brigade arrived in the early hours of the morning, the roof had collapsed and the cottage was an inferno. When they finally managed to extract his body from the ruins, the medical examiners confirmed the horrific truth. The golden voice of the 1960s had been silenced by smoke inhalation and severe burns. He was 44 years old. Steve Marriott died with very little to his name, his bank accounts drained, his body destroyed. Meanwhile, on radio stations across the globe, the infectious, joyful chorus of Itchycoo Park, a song he had written as an optimistic teenager, continued to play, generating endless, untouchable wealth for the corporate entities that owned his stolen legacy. It was a grim final chord to a life of extraordinary talent, consumed by a predatory industry. The trauma of the 1960s did not end with the flames in Essex. When a band is subjected to profound psychological and financial violence, the collateral damage does not vanish when the music stops. The curse of the underworld contracts the stolen millions, and the bitter disillusionment with the recording industry would reach out across the decades to claim the band's second visionary. If Steve Marriott was the explosive, uncontainable raw energy of the Small Faces, Ronnie Lane was undeniably its beating heart and its deeply sensitive soul. Lane, the band's bassist and primary melodic architect, was the gentle counterweight to Marriott's ferocity. He possessed a profound poetic understanding of songwriting, contributing the nuanced, beautiful chord progressions and introspective lyrics that elevated the band far beyond the status of a standard rhythm and blues act. When the Small Faces violently fractured at the end of the 1960s, Lane, alongside Kenny Jones and Ian McLagan, transitioned into a new musical entity simply named The Faces, recruiting Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood. For a time in the early 1970s, The Faces were one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, renowned for their chaotic, alcohol-fueled, and joyous live performances. Yet for Ronnie Lane, the massive stadium success felt increasingly hollow. The industry machinery that had chewed up his youth under Don Arden and Andrew Loog Oldham was still operating, merely wearing different corporate disguises. He found himself increasingly alienated by the massive egos, the staggering corporate greed, and the disconnection from the pure, organic joy of making music. In 1973, in a move that stunned the music press, Ronnie Lane simply walked away from the Faces at the absolute height of their commercial power. He had realized that the stadium rock circuit was an environment toxic to his spirit. Seeking refuge from the predatory nature of the music business, Lane moved to the quiet countryside. He formed a loosely knit, acoustic-driven band called Slim Chance and embarked on a project known as The Passing Show. It was a romantic, wildly impractical endeavor, a traveling musical circus complete with a circus tent, fire eaters, and acoustic folk rock, moving slowly from town to town in a gypsy caravan. It was Lane's desperate, beautiful attempt to return music to the people, free from the grips of manipulative managers and extortionate ticket prices. Living on a dilapidated farm in Wales, Lane finally traded the suffocating neon lights of stadium rock for campfires and the feeling of wet grass beneath his boots. He spent his days repairing old tractors and his nights playing raw, acoustic folk music with local friends, completely detached from the chart positions and corporate pressure that had poisoned his youth. For a brief, shimmering moment, the gentle soul of the Small Faces had found his sanctuary, breathing clean air and reclaiming his artistic purity. Just as Lane found his spiritual peace away from the industry, a dark, devastating biological shadow fell over him. In the late 1970s, Ronnie Lane began experiencing terrifying physical symptoms. He suffered from dizzy spells, extreme fatigue, and a loss of coordination in his hands, the very hands that had crafted some of the most enduring bass lines in British pop history. Following a series of exhaustive medical examinations, he received a catastrophic diagnosis, multiple sclerosis, MS. It was an incurable, progressive neurological disease that would slowly, inexorably strip away his physical mobility and his ability to play music. This diagnosis brought the horrific financial injustices of the Small Faces era crashing back into the present reality with brutal life-or-death consequences. Multiple sclerosis requires immense ongoing medical care, expensive treatments, and continuous physical therapy. Had Ronnie Lane been paid the millions of pounds in publishing royalties and record sales that his 1960s compositions had rightfully generated, he would have been able to afford the finest medical care the world had to offer. He would have been secure. Instead, because his legacy had been stolen by the mob management tactics of the previous decade, one of the greatest songwriters in British rock history found himself fighting a terminal illness while effectively destitute. The tragic irony was not lost on his peers in the music industry, while the corporate executives who owned his publishing rights remained silent. His fellow musicians recognized the profound injustice of his situation. In 1983, in a historic and unprecedented display of solidarity, some of the most legendary guitarists in the world, including Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck, alongside Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman of the Rolling Stones, organized the Arms Action Research into Multiple Sclerosis charity concerts. These massive concerts in London and across the United States were specifically designed to raise money for MS research and to provide a financial lifeline for Ronnie Lane. Footage from the Arms concerts remains some of the most emotionally devastating material in rock archives. In the final moments of the shows, a frail Ronnie Lane, increasingly ravaged by the disease and requiring assistance to simply walk to the microphone, would be brought onto the stage. Seeing titans of rock royalty like Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton standing respectfully behind a crippled, impoverished Lane, playing his beautiful composition, Goodnight Irene, is a profound visual testament to his genius. The musicians revered him. The industry had ruined him. Despite the charity of his friends, the disease progressed mercilessly. Lane eventually relocated to Texas, seeking a warmer climate to ease his physical suffering. He spent his final years confined to a wheelchair, relying entirely on the financial donations of friends and the fierce dedication of his immediate family. On June 4, 1997, at the age of 51, Ronnie Lane passed away. Much like Steve Marriott, the soul of the Small Faces died in a state of financial ruin, a direct casualty of the 1960s slave contracts that had stripped him of his rightful inheritance. The profound, agonizing weight of this history was left entirely on the shoulders of the two surviving members, drummer Kenny Jones and keyboardist Ian McLagan. For Jones and McLagan, surviving the mob managers and outliving their creative partners was a complex, painful existence. They were the custodians of a legacy bathed in both musical brilliance and deep human tragedy. Kenny Jones, the powerhouse drummer whose furious fills had defined the mod sound, experienced firsthand the psychological difficulty of navigating an industry that had traumatized him in his youth. Following the dissolution of the Faces, Jones achieved what many considered the ultimate rock drummer's accolade. In 1978, he was chosen to replace the legendary Keith Moon in The Who following Moon's sudden death. While it was a massive commercial opportunity, Jones faced immense psychological pressure and relentless, often unfair criticism from fans expecting him to replicate Moon's chaotic style. Furthermore, the lingering trauma of the Small Faces era never fully faded. Jones later revealed in memoirs and interviews that the profound mistrust of management figures, a direct legacy of Don Arden, made it incredibly difficult for him to navigate the complex corporate politics of a massive entity like The Who. Sitting behind Keith Moon's massive drum kit playing to 80,000 people in massive stadiums, Jones often felt a profound, isolating chill. He was surrounded by the immense corporate machinery of The Who, treated as an elite hired gun rather than an equal brother in arms. Every time he struck a snare drum, the phantom memories of those sweat-soaked telepathic rehearsals with Marriott, Lane, and McLagan haunted him. He was physically present at the absolute zenith of rock royalty, yet psychologically, he remained a traumatized survivor from the gritty streets of the East End. Ian McLagan, whose swirling Hammond organ provided the psychedelic atmosphere of the Small Faces' greatest works, chose a different path of survival. He relocated to the United States and built a highly respected, prolific career as an elite session musician and touring keyboardist. He played with an astonishing array of global superstars, from the Rolling Stones to Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan. Yet even as he achieved a comfortable, deeply respected status in his later years, the bitterness regarding the stolen years remained palpable. In his remarkably candid autobiography, All the Rage, McLagan extensively documented his deep-seated anger toward the managers who had exploited them. He detailed the decades-long, agonizingly slow legal battles that he and Jones waged in the British courts, attempting to wrestle their unpaid royalties back from the labyrinthine corporate structures that had absorbed the catalogs of Don Arden and Immediate Records. It is a stark, depressing reality of the music business that justice is often entirely posthumous. It was not until the late 1990s and early 2000s, long after Don Arden's era of gangster management had faded into history, and crucially long after Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane were already dead, that the surviving members and the estates of the deceased finally secured significant legal victories. The courts finally recognized the egregious exploitation that had occurred and mandated the release of unpaid royalties. When the millions of pounds finally began to flow back to the creators, it was a victory devoid of any real joy. Kenny Jones and Ian McLagan had won the war, but the cost was unfathomable. The money could not rebuild Marriott's burned cottage. It could not buy the medical treatments that might have eased Ronnie Lane's suffering. The justice was cold, bureaucratic, and tragically late. The cruelest irony occurred in 2012 when the Small Faces were finally, officially inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was an institution acknowledging their status as undeniable architects of modern music. Yet, when the induction ceremony took place in Cleveland, Ohio, only Kenny Jones and Ian McLagan were left to walk onto the stage and accept the trophies. Steve Marriott had been dead for 2 decades. Ronnie Lane had been gone for 15 years. They stood on the podium, 2 men carrying the ghosts of their best friends, accepting the highest honor in an industry that had systematically destroyed their youth. Only 2 years after that bittersweet induction, the curse seemingly struck one last time. In December 2014, Ian McLagan suffered a massive sudden stroke and passed away at the age of 69 in Texas. With his death, Kenny Jones became the sole surviving member of the original Small Faces, the last living witness to both the absolute peak of 1960s musical innovation and the terrifying depths of its criminal exploitation. The story of the Small Faces shatters the romanticized image of the 1960s. The era is frequently remembered as a time of unprecedented artistic freedom, where youth culture broke the chains of conservative society through loud guitars and sharp fashion. But the reality viewed through the lives of these 4 working-class boys from East London was far darker. The counterculture was rapidly and ruthlessly monetized by a deeply unregulated, violent capitalist machinery. They were not treated as artists. They were treated as raw material to be mined, refined, and discarded by men who operated outside the law. Their immense talent was their greatest asset, and simultaneously, their fatal vulnerability. The Small Faces are the most devastating testament to the dark underbelly of the recording industry. They captured the absolute essence of a generation. They defined the mod movement. They created a visionary sound that laid the architectural groundwork for hard rock, punk, and Britpop. Yet their legacy was hijacked, violently stolen by the greed, intimidation, and brute force of the world they unknowingly walked into. Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane, the two primary geniuses who authored this soundtrack, both died in tragic, heart-wrenching poverty. They left this world entirely stripped of the vast fortunes their minds had generated. But the industry could not steal their voices. As those voices continue to echo through the decades, preserved perfectly on vinyl and radio waves, they remain profoundly beautiful, yet undeniably haunting. They will forever serve as a chilling reminder to every generation that follows. The glittering, blinding lights of the stage often require a terrible silent sacrifice, and the true cost of our favorite melodies is too often paid in blood, paranoia, and tears.